Well, it's a great privilege now to introduce Professor Burke. He is former Vice-Chancellor of the University of East Anglia. He's been Chairman of the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes, and in retirement, indeed, I think busier than ever on public policy issues, advising the government and indeed the Church of England about various ethical issues. So, over to you, Derek.
Thank you very much. Well, there's something from the Church Times to watch while I make my few introductory remarks. I've been asked to talk about ethics and public policy. I want to do a scene setter from a newspaper article a week ago. I want to say something about ethics, and that piece I've cut down a bit because some of the ground's been well covered and I want to leave some space for David Cook this afternoon. And then I'm going to talk about two new initiatives in the ethical area, one called the Nolan Committee, which is Ethics in Public Life, and the second, a recent initiative in the UK for a common ethical standard for scientists. And both these are ongoing. And then finally, the last third of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the ethical issues that were thrown up in our job as advising ministers, and John Gummer was the minister I started with, about novel foods, many of which came from GM, and try and show you what a muddle of ethical issues all get wrapped up in these decisions. So just to go back to the beginning, all of us want a high standard of ethics maintained in public policy, in Parliament, in government ministries, in the research councils and the universities. And there are many pressures in the opposite directions, many pressures to distort or to modify policies for the advantage of a person or persons, an institution, a company or a country. All religious people, and indeed all right-minded people, subscribe to the maintenance of high public standards. But implementing them and maintaining them is not easy, given our propensity to err. The price of freedom is constant vigilance is a saying attributed to Edmund Burke, I think not correctly. And I just wish Edmund Burke was a relative, because then I could perhaps claim some genetic inheritance, but it is not so. The price of freedom is constant vigilance. And we who carry the responsibility in our early, middle and later life for public policy have a responsibility to pass on and to safeguard such standards. Let me give a recent example. This is from the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, a week ago, and this is from an article headlined Labour blamed as public loses faith in political system. The article started, public faith in Britain's political system. Oh, and I've got hard copies of all the overheads, which you can have at the end, so don't try and write it all down. Public faith in Britain's political system is being eroded by alarmingly low levels of trust, the Standards Watchdog said yesterday. The Standards Watchdog is the Committee of Standards in Public Life, which I'll come back and talk to you about. A detailed survey of public opinion carried out by the Committee on Standards in Public Life has exposed deep mistrust of politicians, but fewer than 1 in 4 people are saying that they thought ministers tell the truth. And there are the actual numbers from the... Now this is these are questions it's very easy to say yes to. I would not regard this as a very balanced or well-structured inquiry. Why shouldn't you say yes? Because it would have nothing to lose. But even so, the numbers are quite high. The chairman continued, these results should concern all of us who want to live in a healthy democracy, one that is dependent on vibrant, competitive political parties and politicians who need our trust and consent to carry out their critically important roles. And he continued, this suggests a widespread disillusionment in the way the business of government and politics is conducted. People just do not believe that they are being dealt with in a straightforward, honest and open manner. I think that's very serious. It's a problem in ethics. It's a problem to which all religious people, and we Christians in particular, should contribute. So we need agreed standards of behaviour in public policy. We need procedures for dealing with those who break these rules, whether they involve the courts or some other process. And we need constant flexibility since the situations we face change so rapidly. There are other issues apart from these. There are issues over conflict of interest. There are issues over buying peerages, and I don't need to remind the British members here of the row that's currently running over the purchase of honours. Not new in the UK, not new probably in all advanced societies, but become very open and shocking actually in the UK recently. And so we have this committee. We have another initiative which I'll talk about called for a Universal Ethical Code for Scientists, titled Rigour, Respect and Responsibility. In general, the British experience is that such policies of probity are best maintained through a system of checks and balances, with constant renewal and review of what is acceptable and unacceptable, and I'll come back to the processes later. Next I'll say some words which overlap rather with what's been said earlier, and they come from a book by Fraser Watts, who is an academic here in Cambridge and also a minister of a church. It's a series of lectures published under the title Christians and Bioethics. He points out that there are particular concerns over new technologies, for we live in a world in which technology, especially biotechnology, is developing at a bewildering rate. The possibilities are increasing faster than most of us can assimilate. How can we deal with all these questions? And I quote, "First, it is clear that not everything that is possible is also right. The ethical challenge at the present time is to see which of the possible and soon to be possible applications of biotechnology should actually be used. Because the issues are so new and progress is so rapid, we are not yet ready to answer these questions. There simply has not been enough informed, ethically sensitive discussion among society at large for a consensus to emerge about what is and what is not right. Making ethical judgments is a social business." I think that's a very important statement. "It depends on the collective judgment of an ethical community. With biotechnology, we do not have that kind of collective ethical judgments we yet need." I continue. "That makes things very difficult for everyone involved, especially for the scientists who are working on new developments. Scientists are concerned about the ethical proprietaries as much as anyone else, indeed more than most. However, it is difficult for them to decide what research and practical developments are appropriate if society has not given them a way of telling where the ethical dividing line comes. How can politicians regulate the use of biotechnology, for example, on behalf of society if society has no ethical consensus? Developing such a consensus is made difficult by the rapid development of the technology. It is also made difficult by the fact that we do not quite know where we're coming from in making ethical judgments. We live in a pluralistic society in which there are all sorts of approaches to ethical questions. Up to a point, that can be helpful because it safeguards against the totalitarian approach to ethical issues that can arise in a society in which one particular ideology, religious or otherwise, reigns supreme and unchallenged. However, pluralism also has its dangers, because we can reach a point in which ethical discussion becomes completely fragmented and incoherent. It may be difficult for society because it's becoming so incoherent, it may be difficult for society to develop any kind of ethical response to questions such as those posed by biotechnology." Now that was written 10 years ago, and they are wise words, and they're still true. What I have to contribute, and what we as a group have to contribute, is to bring our own personal religious conviction, and mine as a Christian, to bear on these issues and to play a role in working out how society should move. And we have in the Christian tradition and in the Jewish tradition, and I know much less about the Islamic tradition, we have a long history of rigorous debate within the society, within the groups and in the religious traditions, which has sharpened up minds for several thousand years. Those, I find, provide tools, not answers, but tools, for dealing with some of the present issues. We cannot just look up the answers in the Bible or turn to past authorities because the issues are too new. But we do need principles to help us through. So we have to go back to the fundamental principles of whatever belief system we hold and use them to think out what is the right response to the new issues raised by the new technology. Then a bit on ethics. Ethics is partly about what is right and wrong, and partly about the practical consequences of a particular course of action. Christians have shared fundamental values, though even here we do not always agree, for example, over abortion. Christians too share many social concerns with others in society, and three that come to mind immediately are a concern for the general welfare of society, the maintenance of people's rights, and the principle of justice. All these are fundamental values which are often unstated but are in danger of being forgotten. So what can we say about the ethical debate? Well, one thing we can say as Christians is that we don't find the answers to current issues in the Bible. I grew up at a time where people really did look in the New Testament to decide whether smoking was appropriate for Christians or not, extraordinary as it may seem. And I'm reminded of the story of the man who used a pin to seek guidance from God, opening the Bible and using a pin to find a verse. And he tried this, and the verse came up as Judas went out and hanged himself. And he didn't like that, so he tried again, and he said, and the verse came up, "Go thou and do thou likewise." And then he tried a third time. He said, "What thou doest, doest it quickly." So the Bible is not, as it used to be thought, a clear guide for all current issues. Clearly, some of the things it says are everlasting, but doesn't help us when we come to current political debate. Second, there's an issue which I raised yesterday about the way in which we muddle what I would regard as more fundamental issues with consequential issues. There are some things that all of us would regard as absolutely wrong. Torture of young children would be, comes to my mind. That's not a cultural issue. Across cultures, that view would be shared. And we're not interested in whether such an action would lead to have a consequential good outcome, because the starting point is just ruled out. It is a no-go area. It's interesting listening to you talking about the Korean stem cell debacle, where there was clear intent to deceive. There is a universal condemnation in the scientific community who do not go for absolute moral values on the whole, that this is wrong, quote unquote. Nobody is talking about any justification, although the motives for doing it are clear. But in the stem cell debate, all these two levels got mixed up. So, and I was involved a bit in Britain, but a lot in Brussels, where we were trying to work out a consensus, and we had an EU-wide debate with all the parties involved, about 600 people there. It was a good meeting. And Southern Europe doesn't start to discuss the issues of consequentialism, because abortion and embryo experiments are out of bounds. And the Jesuits argued logically and fluidly, as you would expect, that this was so. Whereas the Northern Europeans, the Scandinavians in particular, are interested in the benefits it will bring to society. And these two groups just talked past each other. And the meeting, in the sense that it was meant to try and achieve a cross-EU consensus, failed because the divisions were too deep. But they were too deep not because they disagreed about a subject you could actually debate, but because they were talking about different things. So then there are other distinctions which philosophers make, and I am not going to talk about this because I think David might, the distinction between what philosophers call ought and what they say call is, and what ought, the distinction between what ought to be the case and what is the case. Then there's another confusion, I think, which I'll venture with some hesitation because I think I might be on my own, and that's the distinction between helping people and creating wealth. Helping people is universally regarded as good. We have in Britain, but not in the United States or North America generally, a tendency to distrust the creation of wealth, as if profit, quote unquote, was intrinsically bad, and that companies like Unilever or Monsanto or ICI should run for zero profit, and you will also realize that they would soon go out of business. Now, maybe you don't mind about that, but we would lose their products. I would lose the money that pays my pension, and many of you who are supported by money that comes from the state would lose your salaries too. So we've got to be careful about the hypocrisy of railing against wealth creation and at the same time enjoying a nice job from the Medical Research Council or the civil service. Another anxiety is what is called the slippery slope. People fear that if they begin by making a modest use of a new technology, this will inevitably lead to much wider applications later on, and it will go too far. So people conclude it would be best not even to start. There's some truth in this. But this universal application would mean that we would never have embarked on many of the new technologies that have improved society so much. There's been huge pressure to predict the outcome of a new technology. It's called upstream dialogue. This is the new jargon phrase from Demos. And it means before you have developed the technology and when you just have the science, you decide whether the technology raises ethical issues or not. And then they're trying to apply it to nanotechnology, and it doesn't work very well because nobody knows what the applications are quite going to be. And it certainly wouldn't have worked with the development of the World Wide Web. Who could have predicted that a technology that was developed to exchange and handle large amounts of information that were coming out of the CERN accelerator was going to revolutionize shopping? We've just been trying to buy a fire basket for a new house. And somebody said, you should go on the web, and I did, and there were hundreds and hundreds of the things. And now we've gone from having no choices to having so many choices we can't make our minds up. But I will never again go and look in the showroom because the web is immediately available and is much more diverse. Who could have predicted what that technology does? So this principle of holding back until you know that it's going to be safe hasn't worked in the past. You somehow have to move at a rate at which you can monitor, can stop, can steer, and be flexible. And the precautionary principle in particular is often used to justify the course that if it raises any risk at all, we shouldn't go that way. Well, would we have broken out of, well, we certainly never had an industrial revolution, and would we have learned how any new technologies at all. Then there's the, there's the yuck factor. A rather inchoate repugnance at some of the possible outcomes of a new technology. I can give you an example. There was a considerable public upset a year or two ago at the news that a human ear had been grown on a mouse. The whole episode was little more than a media scare, and in fact what had happened is that a metal framework in the shape of a human ear had been used as a template for growing cells on in tissue culture. And when the cells had completely covered this metal template, the whole structure was taken out and grafted into a mouse which had been immunosuppressed, so there was no rejection. And I think it was a stupid thing to do. But so here, and was a lab gimmick, I think. But here was this mouse with a human ear protruding from the middle of the back. just try and consider possible ethical issues. And I actually thinking about it, and I'd be interested in your reactions, that the young factor is really another word for the term outrage. And outrage is a well-categorized social response to new risk. Outrage would be a perfectly proper way to regard unlicensed building of a nuclear reactor in a site close to a city by people who didn't know the job. Outrage. And outrage is very potent politically and stops things. Others can be dread, the way we regard the threat of a nuclear power station explosion, or stigma, the way the public still regards food irradiation. But it's usually outrage that leads to the death of a new development. So people have said that scientists look at risk as the hazard, or some measure of the hazard, times the likelihood of it happening. It's actually not like that at all. It's hazard plus outrage is in my thinking, the way the public regards risk. And one of our troubles over GM has been different ways of measuring risk. So, how are we to handle all these things? Is it ethical or not to move a gene from one plant species to another? Is it ethical or not to select embryos on the basis of their sex or not? Is it ethical or not to attempt to repair a faulty gene in an early embryo? All these have come up in the last 10 years or so, and we have had real difficulty. Now, public opinion is changing. I can remember when in vitro fertilization and the birth of Susan Brown? No. Louise Brown, thank you. Was a major public relations, a public event. We have two grandchildren born by in vitro fertilization from the parents, as it happened from mother and father, and as it happens, and we thank God for those two children. So in vitro fertilization has been accepted completely over a period of, what, 25 years, something of that sort. So public opinion changes, but technology is moving much faster than public opinion. And that's one of our problems. So how do we decide what's ethical or not? What process of public debate is involved? Where should the final decisions be taken? By the public, by Parliament, and so on. How do we decide in an increasingly heterogeneous population in the UK how and where to make these decisions? There's no easy answer, and I think we are actually, certainly after our recent GM experiences, rather stuck on this one. But let me say something about the Committee on Standards in Public Life next. And again, I've got a hard copy of this, so don't attempt to even read it really. Over the last 10 years or so, determined efforts have been made in the UK to find ways of articulating common ethical issues. The first initiative stems from a committee chaired by Lord Nolan and was known as the Nolan Committee, though it's now known by this other title. It was given wide terms of reference when established in October '94, and the following month John Major said of the committee, it is to act as a running authority of reference, almost you might say as an ethical workshop called in to do running repairs. And it has produced its first report, which is, if I might say so, typical civil service double talk. And we cannot say conclusively that standards of behaviour have declined. I mean, what do you want to say? My question would be, what are you really trying to say? They're just hedging their bets. But they do keep the process moving. As a result, people in public life are not always as clear as they should be about where the boundaries of acceptable conduct lie. That's code for people get it wrong and act incorrectly and offer money for peerages. This we regard as a principal reason for public disquiet. Not surprisingly, it calls for an urgent and remedial action. So, but that's for a committee of the Lords. That's quite strong. Those are quite strong words, really. Then it was renamed, and the 7 Nolan Principles. Now, these are really quite important. This is what is demanded of those who work in public service in any aspect in the UK. selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Their common core is the demand for trustworthiness in public life. And this was a way of articulating how we are to achieve trust. And then there was a companion review, and it kept going. And you heard something that it said in that newspaper article. How have these principles been put into practice? Well, I've seen some of this, and it has changed practice. Transparency, accountability, and inclusivity are the most obvious ones. It means, for example, that the way in which appointments are made to public office has changed. I was appointed as the chairman of what was a new committee, the Novel Foods Committee, in it approached in 86 and 87 and appointed in 89. But a senior and respected food scientist said, Derek, phoned me up, and Derek, would you be interested in doing a little job for government? Half a day, a month sort of stuff. That's what and then you finish up working 2 days a week. Would you like to talk about it? And somebody from the ministry came up, and we talked about it, and I said, yes, I'd like to put something back into public service. And then he passed it up to the minister, and I got a letter, and I was appointed. That's how it used to work. And then I did 9 years, and they decided during that process that nobody should serve longer than 6 as a way of maintaining fairness. And then we started to look for a successor. By that time, the GM row had really broken open, and the job was not a very attractive one. So I was asked by the civil servants to help find a successor. And I talked to a number of people, along with the civil servant, to see if we could find someone who would do the job. And all my colleagues said, no, not on your life. What will it do for me? It won't help my promotion. It won't go into the RAE. All I get is a lot of hassle, and they don't even pay me. And so, all of which was true. So I got sort of stuck. And then the minister, who was still a cabinet minister, said, apparently to the civil servants, not to me, we have somebody, I know somebody in my constituency. And the appointment was made, hey presto. That's how it used to. That was as late as 97. That can't happen now. The jobs have to be advertised. Only those who apply for the jobs can be appointed. People have to, references are taken up, and they are interviewed. I've been the so-called Nolan person on a number of such interview panels. I'm just there partly as a semi-expert, but mainly to see that the process is followed. Now it's produced some difficulties. I was on a committee for BBSRC which advised the chief executive and the chairman of the BBSRC Council, Biotechnology and Biological Research Councils, on the appointment of new members of their council. And people had to apply. And sometimes distinguished people don't want to apply because you can't guarantee that they will be appointed. And over the phone they'd say, so you want me to be a member of the council? And the civil servant would have to say, it wasn't me, it was the civil servant who was doing this. No, we would like you to put in an application for an interview. And if you're very senior, you don't know what happened, and it can go wrong. It happened to me once. I was effectively asked to apply for a job and then told at interview that I wasn't going to get it, and I was very cross. Well, nobody likes being humiliated like that. So then you get to the list of people who have applied, and there's some real no-hopers, and there are 1 or 2 people who might do it, and the obvious person hasn't applied, and you can't appoint them. That's the absolute, that rule really works. What you do is leave the position vacant for a year and ring them up and say, would you like to apply next year? And maybe we could see your... So, I mean, it isn't as quite as... but, it has changed practice. And Nolan is now shorthand for this whole process. Well, Honora O'Neill, in her splendid 2002 Reef Lectures, points out that in the enthusiasm for ever more complete openness and transparency, has done little to build or restore public trust. On the contrary, trust seems to have receded as transparency has advanced. Perhaps, she says, on reflection, we should not be wholly surprised. It is quite clear that the very technologies that spread information so easily and efficiently are every bit as good as spreading disinformation and misinformation. Some sorts of openness and transparency may be bad for trust. And food scares, I would certainly put into that category. They have destroyed our ability to make difficult decisions. So, transparency certainly destroys secrecy, but it may not limit the deception and deliberate misinformation. If we want to restore trust, we need to, this is Honora, we need to reduce deception and lies rather than secrecy. And there is still deception and lies on all sides. So openness may not be the unconditional good that it's fashionably supposed to be. And I've already given an example of how it's worked. An additional problem, of course, is that as the jobs have become more demanding, more public, we produced initially a standard end-of-year report, which the civil servants drafted and I redrafted. But then we had a press conference, and we could always depend on the Guardian food correspondent coming with a lulu. And he turned up once with a bag of a white powder, dumped on the desk and said, "Have you approved that?" And it was quinoa. Quinoa is a plant, Phil knows more about quinoa, but it's a cereal plant, if I remember rightly, Phil, which we had not yet approved. So we said, no, we haven't approved it. He said, I bought it in the market this morning. And press conferences are just disasters, because you have a long sheet of questions and answers from the civil servants beforehand. You have a rehearsal beforehand, and then you come in and you get this. So we had tried to be open. I was available to the media, and so the job became very demanding. And in my first 2 years in retirement, I spent about 2 days a week doing the job. There was no payment. And people are not going to do the jobs. I do a job for EPSRC at the moment. They pay me £80 for the day I attend the committee. But I actually work at least half a day a week the whole year for about £200 a year. So people are doing it out of duty, and a time when I don't need to tell you how oppressed academic life is. And Vice Chancellors are beginning to say, why are you going off to London all the time when you should be writing books and getting out papers? You'll just let the government look after itself. So there's another pressure on the system. So that's the Nolan thing, but it's here to stay, and I applaud it, but it's not that easy in practice. You might want to talk about that. Then there's another new initiative, which I only learnt about quite recently, and that's an initiative that started from Sir David King in this country, called Rigor, Respect and Responsibility, and it's an attempt to get a universal ethical code for scientists. And there was a meeting of G8 advisors, and they agreed to get some guidelines, and then they produced these, I suppose they're rules for ethical behaviour, and they're out for consultation at the moment. Only in government ministries, only in the research councils. I suppose they've gone to universities, but I'm not sure about that. Most of it's things that we would do, I think, without question. Act with skill and care in all scientific work, maintain up-to-date skills and assist their development in others. Take steps to prevent corrupt practices, professional misconduct, and take steps to prevent. That's not easy. Declare conflicts of interest. That's very important. We had inviolable rules on ACNFP about conflict of interest. The rules about conflict of interest were read out at the beginning of every committee meeting. If anybody had a conflict of interest about any item, they had to declare it. We then discussed it, how serious the conflict was, and the person had to leave the room during discussion and was not told the outcome when they came back. But that hasn't always been true. I've heard of cases where people sat in while a situation in their university was discussed, or a big grant application for the next department was discussed. Those rules are now much more firmly applied. Be alert to ways in which research horizon affects the work of other people. That's a big motherhood. And ensure your work is lawful. Most of them are straightforward, and so they're going to be accepted, because I don't know how you falsify them in a classical sense. And this I checked with EPSRC, for whom I'm doing a job, and this is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, which funds all money in engineering, chemistry, material science, IT, all physics apart from high energy physics, and I mean, these are now working principles. It still doesn't prevent improper practice. It still doesn't prevent the honours list, for instance, being used as an outright inducement to act in a certain way. I know 2 people who were told during the course of doing a high-level job, if you go on behaving like this, you won't get your knighthood. And they both got their knighthood, and because they both changed their behaviour. So the honour system is in my view, corruptible, and certainly corrupted by the use of it as a tool by senior civil servants. But, you know, it's progress. You might like to talk about it. Now, I've got about 20 minutes to talk about a few examples of ethical issues that came up while I was chairman of the committee. And the first one was very early on. It was a novel yeast. This was 1988, and we were asked to approve the use of a genetically modified baker's yeast. The yeast, which had been developed by Guy Brocard, who are Dutch, involved changing the ability of the yeast to utilize maltose, which is a simple sugar, by introducing 2 genes from a similar but not identical yeast. Increased utilization of maltose led to more rapid production of carbon dioxide, the end product of fermentation, and to an increase in the rate at which bread rose, so offering a commercial advantage because the bread didn't have to be in the oven so long. This seemed very straightforward, because yeasts have a mating process, there is sexuality in yeasts, and genes can be transferred by such processes. So this could have arisen by a so-called natural process. It was actually done by genetic manipulation. We couldn't see a problem. This was 88. And we said so in the early 1990, a brief press release which announced the product may be used safely. Those were naive days. This is the press reaction. The Times, sort of pontifical. The Independent, bit tart. Today, already, accusing of secrecy. And another one today, half-baked way to slice up nation. A very clever headline. and then the Star, are the boffins taking the rise out of bed? I mean, that is a marvellous headline. And the Consumers Association asked for labelling, because there was no labelling rules in 1990, and the product never came to market. It died immediately. So the company, I'm going to open the window a little bit. I'm getting very warm. You don't mind if I do this? The company got nothing back from its investment, and became very wary of doing any more. So we quickly learned that an adverse press reaction was a disaster. And a number of changes were made. A consumer person came on the committee. An ethical advisor came on the committee. It was John Hawkingham, the first one. There have been a series. And the consumer advisor effectively had a veto, because every major decision went to noise him. The consumer person effectively had a veto, because every decision I would look to Helen Miller and say, okay with you? And she said, I'm troubled, I want to go back and talk to my people, we would hold it for the next meeting. So although there was only one person there, they had a very powerful role in the decision making. And it worked fine for about 5 to 8 years. Then the second example I want to talk about is the case of the transgenic sheep. In 1990, we were asked whether animals from a transgenic breeding program in which the attempted genetic modification was unsuccessful could be used as food. These sheep had been modified to carry the human gene for factor IX, a protein involved in blood clotting and needed for the treatment of haemophiliacs. The gene was introduced by injection into the fertilized egg before reimplantation and rearing. Thus, the introduced gene is present in all the cells of the animal, but is not active in all of them. In this particular case, the clotting factor is released only into the animal's milk, and there are ways of doing this, from which it is readily purified. And this became known as farming with a pH, P-H-A-R-M-I-N-G. The process is, however, not very efficient. In many cases, I'm going to have to shut it. This is a quiet English Sunday. In many cases, the gene was degraded, and sometimes it was reversed or not inserted correctly. So about 1% of the animals finally went through to useful production. What should happen to the 99? I guess a biblical reference. And they just said, can we eat them? Now, we are concentrated on the animals that had no human gene present, but they'd been through an experiment. And you can test, of course, by southern blotting whether the gene is present or not quite easily. So there's no safety issue. Well, I don't know, there's no safety issue if there was a human gene there, probably. But there was certainly no safety issue here. But can you see the headline in the newspaper? Failed experiments to be eaten for sale on the supermarket shelf, you know. So we said to the minister, who was again John Gummer, who accepted that although there was no safety issue, there was certainly a public perception issue, and possibly there was and perhaps an ethical issue. And would consumers object to eating an animal that had been part of a scientific experiment? I think the answer is they probably would. What about the animals containing an inactive human gene? Was this gene just a stretch of DNA like any other? Or was it special because it came from a human being? And I had lots of people say to me, it must be special because it's a human gene. And we know that humans are humans because of their genes. It's an extrapolation of we are nothing but a bag of genes argument. And therefore they say, there must be a little flag on the end of each gene saying, I'm human. And we'd say, no, it's not quite like that. But to them, it had humanness because it came from a human, and therefore should be treated in a way that respected humanity. Would people object to eating an animal containing a human gene? Was it even akin to cannibalism? And so on. Would Muslims and Jews be concerned about pork genes in lamb? And vegetarians about animal genes in plants? And the answer is yes in both cases. We didn't know, and the minister agreed to set up a small group of which I was a member, and we consulted, and we asked people to react, and we interviewed a whole variety of groups, pressure groups, religious groups, and so on. The Christians were divided. What's new? Some had no objections, and many had an uneasy feeling which they found difficult to articulate, which I've called the yuck factor. The Jewish reaction was more straightforward. After all, they've been dealing with subtle issues about food for many centuries. If it looks like a sheep, it's a sheep, was their very sharp response. Muslims and Hindus are much more opposed, and as were the animal welfare groups and also the vegetarians. None of the groups were moved when we pointed out there was effectively no chance of eating the original human gene, because the gene is, of course, multiplied many million-fold in the process of growing up the new product. They were even concerned if the gene was completely synthetic. Now, wasn't that interesting? you know you can make a synthetic gene by just stringing the nucleotides together. So because it had the sequence of a human gene, it attained a special quality which meant that it had humanness. Well, they were very concerned about the slippery slope. Now, I wouldn't have any concern about eating a sheep containing a single human gene, say for factor 9. After all, I make factor 9, and this is just a human gene for factor 9. But what if the sheep contained 100 human genes, or 1,000 human genes, or 10,000 human genes, or was 50-50 sheep-human? At some point we say, yuck, and stop. I want David to come back on this later today if he will. But it's outrage. It's not, I don't think it's ethics. I think it's outrage. And we have this deep-seated gut reaction, which I only partially understand, and which I'm sure is culturally dependent. We don't eat dogs, and the French do. Well, it's a very trivial example. So food is very culturally dependent, and one of the reasons that GM has gone wrong in Europe is that Europeans care much more about the provenance of their food than do North Americans, and the Austrians in particular are very concerned about where their food comes from, and so of course all the organic farmers. So we made recommendations about labeling, informed choice, and in fact it was too complicated and the product never went to market. So these sheep were just incinerated and destroyed because they couldn't be put back in the fields, they couldn't be sold, they couldn't be eaten. And that was and we started off with a rather simplistic idea that let's try and get something out of this necessary loss. Right. Third case, antibiotic resistance genes. The issues of a possible hazard from the spread of antibiotic resistance genes arose first in the consideration of a GM maize produced by then Siva Geigy. This had a gene for antibiotic resistance because of the way in which the gene processing had been done. It was unnecessary for the product. We were asked, could this gene be transferred from the maize in the diet, in the gut, to the bacteria living in the gut, incorporated, and under selection pressure, for example, during administration of the antibiotic, then multiply, be excreted, be picked up by animal handlers, and so increase the percentage of antibiotic resistance in the population. Now, antibiotic resistance in the population, as you know, is very high, and we only have one antibiotic left, actually, and it's really troubling. So people divided about. You also see this is a very tenuous construction of possibilities, and so the risk is enormously low, and we didn't know what it was. We actually costed a survey of doing an experiment to feed this maize to 100 sheep and to get all the excreta and look at the bacteria and to see if the gene had been transferred, and it was, the cost was out of order with the problem. So we refused the product because we thought that it was just a little bit too risky. We were overruled in Brussels, actually, because at that stage it was going to Brussels for approval. And that illustrates the problem of what you have to do about very low levels of risk. How do you decide when the risk is so low that it can be safely set aside? And I've been asked by Jeremy Paxman, so Professor, is there no risk in this new product? Well, there is a small amount of risk. So, things which are risky are being fed to our children in experiments and then cut, you see. And that, it's a disaster from a public relations point of view. We cannot explain to people about low levels of risk. We don't understand it ourselves. risk as measured scientifically, if you like, by technological methods, is very different from perception of risk. Perception of risk is socially determined and constructed, and people are very, and there's a lot of social science work on this, are very varied in the way they regard risks. And some risks they're perfectly prepared to accept, and some they rather enjoy, like bungee jumping, because they choose to do it, and others, especially about food, seem to be no-nos. I've got about 5 minutes left, I reckon. I started a bit late, I plead. I'll just spend 5 minutes talking about GM soya, genetically modified soya, because that's a case study in itself. I was chairman of the committee when genetically modified soya came for approval, and we approved it and said so to the minister. The soya is grown widely in the United States, North and South America, not grown in this country. The beans are ground during the grinding, and there's a fat extraction. During that process, the DNA is broken down. The meal is then ground and goes into about 80% of the products you see in the supermarket. It's a nutritious filler. The GM soy have been modified with the insertion of a gene from a soil bacterium, which was widely available, which carried a gene which meant that the effect of the herbicide Roundup no longer worked. So it was a single gene transfer. The gene sequence was known. There have been extensive feeding experiments done. Nobody could find any risk. But Monsanto offered the product without choice because they said we cannot separate back to the field level in Kansas GM soya and non-GM soya. It means separate elevators, separate trains to Lake Superior, separate ships across the Great Lakes, separate ships across the North Atlantic, different processing lines, and we're not going to do it. And so there was no choice. I still think choice would have been very difficult, but it would have been possible. So we don't think there was a safety issue, and still don't think there's a safety issue. But just about that time, Pushtai published his experiments on the claiming that rats were given cancer by eating genetically modified potatoes, a claim which has not held up. The Greens ran a very professional and articulate campaign against GM foods in general and GM soya in particular, and the product has never been sold in Europe, although it is widely used in North America. And I say over and over again, the North Americans have done a very big clinical trial for us. 300 million Americans have been eating GM soya for about 10 years, and there has never been a problem in the most litigious society in the world. And so I don't think actually there's any risk, but it's unusable. Now why is that? Well, loss of confidence in authorities is one. The suspicion that we were doing something secret. Secondly, that we're being suborned by industry. Quite outrageous statements were made about me, actually, they're still on the website, about how we're being corrupted by contact with industry. If you work for Greenpeace, you are absolutely neutral, and you're not influenced by funding. If you have a research student that's funded by ICI, you're down the grade. A third issue was damage to the environment, and the field trials have been run, and Phil Dale knows all about that. The fourth issue, which was, I think, very important, was this was seen as a way of stopping globalization. Here were Monsanto in St. Louis, Missouri, dictating what the British consumer was going to buy and eat. And I went to St. Louis and gave a seminar on what went wrong in Britain, and 300 people were there in the lecture theatre, and the chief executive said, we blew it. But they had not realized, because they'd not done their enough work for what was happening. And finally, it offered consumers no advantage. And consumers previously had bought GM products, GM tomato in particular, which offered a consumer advantage. So, very briefly, there were a whole variety of reasons which were why this product was rejected and continues to be rejected. and it's gone to the WTO, and it's still not resolved. Were they ethical reasons? Well, there were certainly social and political reasons. I'm not sure that really almost any of them were ethical reasons. Possibly the objection to genetic modification on the grounds that it was unnatural and involved changing a genome permanently. But anybody who knows anything about plant breeding knows we've been doing this very hard for 50 years. And that you obtain new cultivars like short-stalk wheat by exposing them to X-rays and mutagens until you kill 99.9% of the plants, and the 0.1% of the weak, wobbly things that survive, you look after hoping that they're a genetic mutant that might be useful. And that's how plant breeding has been done for a long time now. We saw as an extension. So it was unnatural to some and perfectly normal to others. So all sorts of value systems came into play. Well, I should stop. The point I want to make is we have found it incredibly difficult to make decisions in this area. There is a mix of ethical reasons. There is from a population which is very sensitive about food, but which has quite different I was also troubled by other factors, anti-globalization being one, for example. There was the effect of the media, and I'll show you the effect there. There is the very effective professional lobbying of the lobby groups. So who really made the decision? The committee certainly made a decision which was unenforceable. Did the green groups make the decision? Looks like it to me, actually. And the green groups made it impossible for the politicians to do anything else but put up regulations that made it impossible to sell it in the UK. Now, is that what we want? Well, other methods have been tried and they're not working, and I don't have time to talk about them, but we might take questions and discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Questions, please. Yeah.
Seems to me that there's been a fairly selective use of the word GM. I mean, I've always sat here wondering, what would Coca-Cola do if we told people that aspartame, the sweetener, is produced by GM bacteria? I mean, maybe things have gone on behind the scenes, but I'd love to know what would happen.
Well, in general, people will accept products from genetic modification if they're useful in human medicine. And so human growth hormone, which used to be extracted from cadavers and carried the risk of contamination with CJD and caused CJD, has been replaced by GM human growth hormone. It's safer, it's cheaper, it's more readily available, it's more uniform. Big consumer advantage. So it's not intrinsic to the technology. Coca-Cola, well, I suppose you could argue it's necessary for health. It's necessary for the survival of the North American, probably. And perhaps of the younger ones in this country. I don't drink it. But yeah, good question. Lots of inconsistencies. Yeah. The question over there. Interesting.
I'd like you to engage a little further with the sociology of risk, and in particular the kinds of work that Ulrich Beck has done in Risk Society, noting that in modern society with so many different new types, exposures to new types of, say, trace elements of all kinds, people perceive that they live in a very risky environment in which you cannot attribute the outcome in a causal way, but only in a statistical way, to the presence of certain pollutants or other things. So that what you have are people who would like accountability, tremendously frustrated at their inability to attribute either their cancer, their child's asthma, or the autism to something, will gravitate, there are lightning rods that will go up, that will like the MMR,
the GM will become the lightning rod.
Well, that's right. So now, if that's the problem, rather than the GM, how do you deal with the Risk Society?
Well, good question. You might have some answers. We are almost paranoid about risk. I grew up in the Second World War in Britain, and I was told what to do when a German paratrooper came to your front door, that you threw a bag of pepper in his face. You know how long I would have lasted. So risk is a bit relative. We live in the safest society that's ever lived. I think we would agree. We spend our times worrying about our safety. Is that because there's no bigger threat? I guess is what I'm more seriously saying. That doesn't help us, but it might be a partial part of the explanation. The media sells papers on the basis of scares, there's no question, and they've told me this and they know what it does. So how do we explain, persuade, offer to people explanations which are A, saying there is no escape from risk, there is no Garden of Eden which is risk-free. B, the statistics has to be the tool because the numbers are so large. And C, there are lots of things we don't know. We don't know what the problem about autism is. And D, perhaps, that association is not causal, and MMR would be another case. Now, those are quite complicated ideas. So you can do them in focus groups or in small group conferences. You can't do it to the population in general. And we're in a situation where everybody wants to make their own decision, including my children about everything. And that's okay. We're very independent, choosing society. So no longer do authorities have any respect. I started science when people in white coats sold washing powder, soap powder on the television, and they said this product is the best you can have. It's a consumer who sells it now. So I don't know the answer actually. Maybe you've got some suggestions.
Let's not go over lunch.
Okay, all right. But I mean, so it's outside science. I think we'd agree on that. It's social science.
Social science is still science.
Well, it's outside technology, science and technology. Let's put it that way.
I don't agree.
It's not biochemistry and gene manipulation. And back to your question, why are they worried? Well, GM has become a label for something that I don't like. I think we probably agree about that. Yeah.
I think there is a tendency to overcomplicate the whole risk issue. And I think if scientists could think a little bit more in the way that journalists do. I mean, journalists have scales. They don't deal in kilometres or kilograms. They deal in double-decker buses and the width of the human head. And when it comes to risk, they deal with chances of getting struck by lightning, winning the lottery, getting hit by a car, the chances that you're going to wake up and have breakfast that morning. That's how journalists deal with it. And
it doesn't resolve it because this is being done to us by some unseen authority over which we have no control. People meeting in secret. There was a television thing called Behind Closed Doors. Every decision that was made in a committee behind closed doors was suspect. Whereas if you're knocked down by a car, it's because you walked into the road.
What I mean is that there are ways of equating risk. You actually said in what you were saying is it's really hard for us to actually get across. But when Jeremy Paxman asked you, he said, "Is there a risk?" And you said, "Well, of course there is a small risk." The response to that question needs to be framed in a context that the journalists understand.
Yes, and you can then say it's less than the chances of winning the lottery for a £1 stake or something like that. And again is what people choose to do. And there's a deep aversion to being exposed to risks which are not of your choice. The latest campaign from WWF, they have found chemicals, quote unquote, in bread,
Working on that.
The lottery issue, I think, is interesting because the difficulty with that, tied with media, is that week by week we see someone win the lottery.
Yes.
So a 1 in 14 million risk
is real.
Happens every week.
Yeah.
So you say it's 1 in 10,000, I'm dead already.
Yes, I've always preferred the kind of comparisons of things that they're familiar with in the sense that that we believe that this GM food is no more risky. Okay, everything has a risk, but it's no more risky than the food you're eating every day. And kind of rather than to talk about the lottery and so on. But my question is really about the risk-benefit analysis. And one of the problems with our regulatory process is it concentrates on risk.
Yes.
And there's very little about benefit. And much of what we talked about at this meeting is a kind of risk-benefit
yes.
assessment.
Yes.
And yet we're prevented in the regulatory process from
Yes.
considering about benefit.
Yes.
And now it's going to be very, very difficult to change the regulations
Yes.
to allow that to happen.
Yes.
But in everything we do a risk and
Yes,
benefit
I
analysis.
agree with that. I tried to change the rules on ACNFP into risk-benefit and failed. And one part of the argument was that you cannot determine the benefit in social, societal terms because the product just might never be sold. So this was actually during the Conservative administration, and they said the market will determine the benefit. And all our responsibility as governments are to ensure as best we can that food on sale is as safe as the conventional product, if you like. Then people will make choice, and that's an argument, absolute argument for labelling, and that's why labelling of GM occurs. But by the time that had happened, the product had been stigmatized so that nobody would buy it anyway. And now I notice that M&S advertise as a plus that none of their foods contain GM ingredients. As a result, I don't buy food from Marks and Spencer's because I don't think I'm going to be lulled by that line.
But the problem is the things that, there are some things, products going on now that, to my mind, have a clear benefit.
Yeah, the potato...
Potato blight resistance,
yes.
where you can avoid spraying about it doesn't find
yeah.
against blight. Yet that has been demonised because it's
yes.
because it's GM.
Well, as you know, Phil, the one product that has, apart from a food product that has come into wide use is the insect-resistant cotton in China, and that's got a gene from a bacteria, the BT gene, and that prevents, removes the necessity for spraying. The spraying was done by workers in the fields wearing padded clothing and with a pack on their back of a toxic chemical. And there are a finite number of deaths in those who spray the cotton per year. And BT cotton gives us the same or high yield, I can't remember. And there are no deaths. So China has gone, I think that's right, Phil, you'll probably know more about this than me. I think China's is going very heavily for BT cotton. Of their own make. They don't buy it from Monsanto, they've just made their own product. They're clever people. So there's a clear benefit, but in China, I think decision making is rather more crisp and simple. And I don't want that sort of decision making, but somebody decides and that's it.
I mean, but there are environmental trade-offs that come with things. I mean, the GM soya now in Southern America, is causing quite a considerable problem in the ability to remove it from the field if you try to change crop. You can't.
No, you just use another herbicide.
That's
I Phil will know more about this, but that's true of any new cultivar. You get these stragglers coming through, and it's a wrecking. Phil, correct? That's
well, there were, before Roundup Ready came along, there were herbicides that we used to control the weeds, and those people go back to using those if there's a problem.
Yeah.
But I think there has been a tendency to overuse them. In Argentina, you get 2 crops a year, and it just goes on and on and on.
Right.
And I think the rotation.
So anyway, you were making a more general point.
Well, yeah, and I don't think. I mean, it's certainly the reports that are coming out from South America. They're not always from the biased sources. There are problems around.
Yes, of course, there are in any drug of any new product.
So it's not a panacea. And the same with the BT cotton. I mean, it's going to have a life history, and then we're going to have to find another as the insects become resistant to the BT. And so it's going to have a distance to run.
But that's an argument for never introducing new technology. And I spent my life trying to use science to be of advantage to humans.
No, I mean it's more of a coin, but it's not going to be a solution that lasts for a long time. You're going to have to constantly build on it with the next one along.
There is one agronomic advantage of soya, and that is that you can sow direct into the ground and drill sow without having to plough. and in the Middle West, that's a big advantage. So you drill so everything grows up. It's actually exactly like the tares and the wheat in the New Testament. And you spray once, with a known and well accepted herbicide. So yes, these arguments are much more complicated. I think we would both all agree, much more complicated than they can be presented in the newspaper article. So, but since everybody won't accept a decision by a scientist or a minister or a green group as the way of making the decision making, how do we make decisions is my problem.
Yes.
Microbiologist can tell me, pardon my ignorance, why insects don't like the modified potatoes?
Why insects don't like?
Yeah. What is wrong that they don't eat it?
Oh, this is the potato blight we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a fungal infection, correct? Potato blight?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to let him answer the question because it's his field.
They've taken a gene from a wild potato, and often you get resistance genes in wild potatoes.
But what is the property which makes it so unattractive?
Well,
for
it's
insects?
just a fungicidal protein in the leaf.
It's smell. Or what?
No.
It's a well, no, it's not smell. It's just a fungicide that kills the fungus.
Oh, okay.
So
And it's natural.
prevents it
It's not a chemical, it's natural. Sorry, I'm just pulling things.
It's a protein in the...
Good. Any more questions? Yeah.
You've mentioned several times this problem of the declining respect for the authority of scientific expertise, which is very difficult to put one's finger on, I think, in the public mind. And I think the public is very ambivalent about this. On the one hand, they're very grateful, eagerly grateful for the benefits that scientific advance produces, and they never thank scientists for that, they just accept them and buy the products. But on the other hand, there's this deep-rooted and rather inchoate suspicion of science. And I mean, to what extent is this perception, well, what is the basis of this perception? Is it to do with the sense that, you know, while scientists have been responsible for some of the best advances in civilization, they've also been complicit in some of the worst disasters and developments? For example, yes. How does one address that question and analyze it?
respond to it.
Well, by a more sophisticated argument than you can run in the Daily Mail, which is along the lines that no, technologies are neither good nor bad in themselves, but that their application and their use can lead to good or bad outcomes. And our job is to select one and not the other, and avoid the other. That's easy to say. It's of course much harder to do, because once the technology is out there, you can't control it. So what has happened in this case is that the technology has become stigmatized, in the same way that food irradiation became stigmatized. Food irradiation is the safest way of sterilizing food, but it leads to millionth of a second radioactive decay after the irradiation. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but it's that sort of order. And so it is true, it was radioactive. And that product is unusable, though I suspect that strawberries I'm buying are lasting a long time in the fridge. I noticed, and I wonder whether they've been irradiated or they're not labelled. And I'm told that if you go into Central Africa from South Africa, you take all your food with you and it's irradiated, because it will last the whole time you're there. So the risk and this is a risk-benefit calculation. You know, the risk of eating local food is very high. So, yeah. There's no benefit. So the enigma is that there will be huge changes in the way food is grown, prepared and processed. And the consumer has not been asked about those. So we switched, Phil will help me if I'm right, to short-stalked wheat over a matter of 2 or 3 years. And longer than that. But it's a mutant, obtained by mutinization and selection, I think.
There are some natural genes around as well.
Okay. Nobody put labels up outside the supermarket saying don't eat bread from short-stalk wheat because it's obtained from a mutant. So there's lots of perception issues here.
I suppose that, I mean, people are worried by the disasters that there have been.
Of course.
They, like BSE,
Yes.
which seem to stem from doing something unnatural, kind of cannibalism.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that sort of fed
Yes.
into this whole perception
Yes.
later on with other things that are completely different.
Yes, I agree with that. And the natural has become a good. The natural is now a value, and it's a value that's espoused by some green groups, by the organic farmers. I don't necessarily say being natural is a bad thing, but it's become a value in its own right. And so doing something unnatural is improper and might bring disaster. We've been doing things unnatural, Rodney, since we ceased to be hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, quite right. I don't dispute that myself.
And so the question is, and not all of them are good. Some of them are just terrible. I think there's almost a pantheism which regards the world as something which is sacrosanct in its own right. It's almost like an extension of the Gaia idea, that this is a self-existing system which we mustn't disturb.
Interesting, yes. Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, just to come back to the more sort of general issue, question from the back there. I mean, it seems to me there are a couple of things that scientists can or cannot do, should not do, in terms of science communication, which can be helpful. One is the oversell, and I think that can be a problem. I know it's been a problem in GM, but I think it's been a problem in stem cell therapy to some extent. And I think there are not just media people, but I think there are certain scientists who have oversold it. So, if it then doesn't deliver all that it was promised, apparently, to deliver, then obviously there's a sense of disappointment to the public. It says, oh, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So you get sort of cycle going on. So I think it's very important that the scientists don't oversell things. But equally, I think scientists sometimes can be defensive, when people point out things that have gone wrong in science and the way it's been abused, and they get very defensive, and they sort of, oh no, But I think a real openness to accept, many of the terrible things have been done in the name of science, the way it's been used and so forth. I think it's terribly important, actually, as it is in religion. I actually find myself doing both, one in religion and one in science. People say terrible things have been done in religion. Of course they have. Yeah, absolutely agree. Ditto science. So I think if one has this sort of more slightly relaxed but more open, honest attitude, I think maybe that helps. But
yeah, good point.
Just a general point. I was on a commission for 4 years, and there were representatives from Greenpeace and the different groups like that. One or two from industry and so on. And I came to the conclusion, after kind of years of so-called debate, really was debate, that GM is really the sideshow of the real issues. And the real issues are about globalization, about the power of big business, about the feeling of stuff being forced on us in the UK. That seemed to be the thing that kind of united people more. If there's ever a discussion on Monsanto, the evils of Monsanto, that kind of united people, or the activist people, more than GM did. And I often felt that if PBI had still been in existence down the road, and we did 6 years of these experiments, or I did 6 years of these experiments, there was no problem at all. And it was only
GM crops in the field.
GM crops in the field, experiments and so on. The first experiment I did in '87, the first phone call I got was from a farmer who wanted to be the first to grow these things, these modified potatoes. So there was never any problem at all until essentially Monsanto, Seabird, as Derek has outlined, started to ship them over. And there was a feeling then, and I think it's a bit unfair, but there was the feeling then that these were being thrust upon us, they were being loaded onto boats. We didn't want them in the world, yet we were going to have to accept them. okay, gone through the regulations here, but there was that feeling that perhaps if we'd have done it ourselves and had had dialogue, and we did have lots of dialogue in those first years, lots of discussions, then it would have been much more acceptable in the public sector.
And that's very interesting, I think, isn't it? Because yeah, it does seem to be, you know, one or two global players, and why is it a monopoly and not?
Well, at the same time as this was happening, the agri-food business was rationalising down to about 5 big players. In the same way that oil went down to the 5 sisters, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm not defending that, but that's what happened.
I mean, that's the thing that none of us mentioned over the weekend, and probably an area of that as well, is patenting. And the grabbing of patents has given such power to a few people, and Myriad Genetics in the medical world, and Monsanto in the agricultural world. And
but you say grabbing, but it's a perfectly legal process.
No, it's bizarre.
That's a value judgment.
No, it's not value. No, it's not value judgment. The bending of patent legislation that had to occur to allow genes to fit into it was bizarre. And genes do not fit under standard patent legislation. And
who made that decision?
Who made the decision to change it, or who
decided to bend the rules, in your words? It would be the US regulatory authorities, the FDA.
I'm not entirely sure.
Well, I think it would have to be the FDA. Yeah.
Because, yes, and it's then being replicated across in Europe, and all the other patenting bodies have gone down similar.
Well, the European Patent Office is technically independent. You're saying it's been suborned? I'm just trying to push your argument a little bit. Because I'm not. There are lots of problems with patents, but it's a system we have.
A patent has to be an invention.
Yes.
It has to be novel.
Yes.
So and you have to have done the inventing. So you invented the gene. No. So that one falls out. It's novel. It's never been around before. No. It just doesn't fall under any of the categories, and everyone acknowledges it. It's not a surprising statement that the patenting is better. But the power that it gives to the patent holder. And the rush just to grab patent sequences and patent sequences where you don't even know what the function is. And okay, that's starting to be taken back.
I agree with
some of this. That's why there's so few players.
It's a system we have. And another thing that happened at the same time is that government stopped funding research in their own money. So, and Phil will tell you sad stories there. So government said, companies do it.